They handed it to him on a silver platter. South Korea has a new president, Lee Jae-myung. All the polls saw it coming. This was the moment for Lee Jae-myung. And I say this time because this guy has been trying to become president for 8 years. And with everything that's happened in the country lately, it was clear it was now or never. The land of K-pop is trying to finally put an end to the massive political crisis it's been going through. A crisis that's been dragging on for 6 months, ever since the self-coup attempt by former President Yoon Suk-yeol, and the first step on the road to recovery. These latest presidential elections. South Koreans were eager to vote, and that is exactly what they did.
The total voter turnout in the presidential elections is 79.4%, the highest in 28 years.
When he declared an illegal martial law, which we already talked about here on VisualPolitik, Yoon signed his own political death sentence and kicked off a wave of chaos like the country had never seen before. And no, we're not exaggerating. Since then, South Korea has gone through 4 different presidents, a spiral of impeachments and relentless parliamentary attacks from the opposition, the Democratic Party. Because in this real-life K-drama, we've seen it all. Military officers smashing windows to break into the National Assembly, former Defense Minister Kim Yong-hyun trying to take his own life in prison, former President Yoon barricading himself inside the presidential residence to avoid arrest, and the police storming the place, a mob of Yoon supporters storming a Seoul courthouse, leaving a trail of destruction, former Prime Minister Han getting removed from office and then reinstated by the courts. And finally, just to not make this list any longer, the Constitutional Court permanently removing Yoon from office, which triggered yesterday's presidential election. The result? What you're about to see now. Amid all the chaos, Lee Jae-myung pulled off a win with 49.4% of the vote, beating his conservative opponent Kim Moon-soo by almost 3 million votes. And keep in mind, Kim had an extra handicap. Another right-wing candidate was also running. That split the conservative vote even more. And when that happens, it's pretty much game over for the right. On top of that, President-elect Lee is about to enjoy an advantage South Korea hasn't seen in years. He'll start his term with his party holding a strong majority in the National Assembly. In other words, he'll have control of the executive branch and the legislative branch from day one, which means he can push through almost any kind of reform right from the start. Something that, by the way, former President Yoon could never do. He always governed with a minority, and that in fact was the spark that ignited the clash with the legislature, the clash that ended his attempted self-coup. Now, even if Lee has all this going on for him on the streets, things are way more complicated. South Korean society is more divided and tense than ever, and that's a problem that's been building up for a long time. And of course, Yoon's martial law and the damage he did to the country's institutions didn't help at all. In fact, did you know that back in January of last year, someone tried to stab the new president in the neck? VisualPolitik community. If you still think I'm exaggerating when I say Korean politics has turned into a nightmare, it's because you haven't seen anything yet. Just listen to this.
In a recent survey by the Seoul-based think tank East Asia Institute, over 30% of people expressed doubts about election fairness.
In fact, just look at how far this whole thing has gone. Among supporters of the Conservative Party, the one that was in power until now, almost 1 in 3, said that a dictatorship can be better than a democracy depending on the situation. Did you know things had gotten this bad in South Korean politics? Well, this is just the appetizer for what's coming next. The thing is, many South Koreans are hoping that the election of the new president will finally let them see the light at the end of the tunnel. Lee is expected to fix a slowing economy, but more importantly, he's expected to heal the country's social divide. A divide that keeps getting deeper and spreading across all fronts. Young versus old, men versus women, the rich versus the middle class. But what if I told you that might not happen? What if Lee's election is just the next chapter in this long political crisis? Well, that's exactly what we're going to talk about in this video, among other things, because South Korea's new president is a figure surrounded by controversy, and he might end up prolonging the pain. And here's a spoiler, Lee is a polarizing figure in South Korea, mainly because of his stance toward China and his legal troubles. In this video, we're going to break down exactly who he is, what he believes, and yes, all of the scandals and controversies he's been involved in. We'll also look at what the future could hold for South Korea, and let me tell you in advance, it's not looking great. Because yes, if you thought that after all this chaos, the country was finally going to get a decent, unifying, model politician, the kind of leader South Korea desperately needs right now, well, spoiler, that's not what happened. It seems like Koreans really love the drama. That's the reality. Could South Korea end up in an even worse place than it is now? Stick around, because in this video we're going to break it all down from start to finish with all of the details.
Towards an uncertain destination.
Let's start from the beginning. Who is Lee Jae-myung? And where does he come from? Well, here's the thing. Lee is a very familiar face in South Korean politics. At 61 years old, he's the fifth of 7 children in a poor family. His profession? Human rights lawyer and activist against South Korea's military dictatorships back in the 1980s. As a child, he had to start working in a factory before even finishing his basic education, which he eventually completed while working until he made it into university. After that, a nearly 2-decade career as a lawyer, followed by a rapid rise in politics since 2005. He became mayor of his hometown Seongnam, then governor of Gyeonggi province, then a lawmaker, and now president of the country. So yeah, we're not exactly talking about a political newcomer. The problem is that Lee is also a deeply divisive figure, even among center-left voters. Why? Because of his populist style, his socialist-leaning proposals, and his legal troubles. Yes, legal troubles, alleged corruption cases. So right off the bat, there are plenty of red flags. This new president is already stepping into office with a whole bundle of legal issues trailing behind him. But we'll get into that in just a moment, because there is a lot to unpack. Lee's career is expected to lean more left-wing, colder towards Japan, and at the same time more open to closer ties with China. But above all, it's expected to take a more skeptical stance towards the US in its foreign policy. And when I say leaning more left, I mean seriously. Lee has long pushed for a stronger role for the state in redistributing wealth, especially the wealth generated by the country's massive business conglomerates, the chaebol, and the ultra-rich families behind them. We're talking about giants like Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and SK, which together make up a huge part of the country's GDP. Lee wants to hit them with significant tax increases, both the companies and the families that control them. Because here's the deal. South Korea's economic model, the one that pulled it out of poverty between the 1970s and 1990s, has over time concentrated way too much wealth and power in few hands. And too much is putting it mildly. About 40% of the entire GDP depends on just 4 conglomerates and the families who run them. And here's the extra problem. That system has fueled corruption between politicians and big business. Think about the incentives. Politicians granting favors, looking the other way, or turning a blind eye in exchange for bribes. This kind of high-level corruption, the kind you often see in K-dramas, it's non-fiction. It's been a recurring issue in South Korea, and Lee says he wants to tackle it head-on. How? Mainly through fiscal redistribution. He's been called the Korean Bernie Sanders for a reason. For example, for many years, he pushed the idea of a national basic income to reduce inequality and boost the economy. And remember, while in Europe that might not sound too wild, in Korea, the idea of getting money from the government without earning it first by working is pretty new.
When he was governor, Lee launched a pilot basic income program with direct cash payments. He also proposed handing out 250,000 won vouchers, that's about $200, to all citizens to stimulate the economy. And he even floated ideas like cutting the work week to 4.5 days, ending the single-term presidency, and creating a system for recalling lawmakers before their term ends.
But here's the twist. In the presidential campaign, almost all of those proposals either disappeared or were heavily watered down. Why? Because Lee's a seasoned player. Like we said, he's a political veteran. He knows how to soften his message to avoid scaring off moderate voters. Take basic income. It's now gone. Now he talks about universal basic rights and reviving the economy through social capitalism. Basically, vague terms that could mean anything. You know the trick, saying a lot while actually saying nothing. That said, there are some things we can expect from him in the short term. For instance, a judicial reform. His party wants to expand the number of Supreme Court justices from 14 to wait for it, somewhere between 30 and 100, meaning that most of them would be appointed under his presidency. They also want to create a judicial review committee to keep judges in check under the banner of transparency and accountability. As for prosecutors, Lee's plan is to split their investigative and prosecutorial roles and set up a new disciplinary dismissal system. On paper, it might look like a regular reform, the kind you'd see in many countries. The problem? These reforms are coming from a man who is currently neck deep in legal trouble, and that's where things get really interesting. Because the new president is already surrounded by a cloud of alleged corruption and political misconduct, even before taking office, and that's a serious issue. For starters, the Supreme Court ruled last May that Lee broke electoral law by deliberately lying during his 2022 presidential campaign, and in South Korea, that's a criminal offense. What's more, the court overturned a previous acquittal and ordered a new trial, which is still pending. And yes, that's the same Supreme Court that Lee now wants to completely reform. See where this is going? If convicted, Lee could be banned from holding office for at least 5 years, which means, and this is the surreal part, he's now waiting on a court ruling that could declare him ineligible to be president even though he's already in office. So what's the first move Lee made after getting elected? Easy. Try to avoid that scenario, because another political crisis is the last thing the country needs. And how's he going about it? Well, no beating about the bush here. Lee's party went after the judges, claiming that the legal cases against him are nothing short of a judicial coup.
Democratic Party alleges judiciary coup, threatens to impeach Supreme Court justices.
His party hasn't just threatened to remove judges for going after Lee, they've even gone as far as proposing a reform that would suspend all trials against presidents once they're elected.
Democratic Party of Korea proposes bill to suspend trials for president-elects.
And yes, just like you're probably thinking, that proposal would clearly benefit Lee himself, which already raises serious red flags about how he might use his presidential powers. Now, going back to Lee's legal troubles, as if all of that wasn't enough, he's also embroiled in several corruption scandals. He's currently facing a criminal trial over bribery linked to real estate development projects and permits from his time as mayor of Songnam.
He's accused of colluding with private real estate developers to help them make huge profits in a project worth over $1 billion, while the city itself ended up taking a financial loss. We're talking about a case that's been open for 2 years, with a case file of over 200,000 pages, and it's something Lee may have to face while already serving as president.
And that's not all. He's also facing charges for misusing public funds for personal expenses and for allegedly being involved in irregular money transfers to North Korea in 2018. See, when I say K-dramas are tame compared to real Korean politics, we mean it. So yeah, it's a full-blown legal mess, and he hasn't even started governing yet. And how it ends? No one really knows. Because here's the thing. South Korea's constitution grants criminal immunity to sitting presidents, but it's unclear what happens when those cases were already active before taking office. This could turn into another huge political storm depending on which legal interpretation wins out if he's ultimately convicted. Could this be the next big political earthquake? Now, if there's one area where we might see major changes, it's in foreign policy, especially regarding China, Japan, the US, and North Korea. This is actually where we could see the most dramatic shift. Because, as we've said many times here on VisualPolitik, former President Yoon Suk-yeol did a lot of things wrong, and his coup attempt was the final straw. But when it came to foreign affairs, he did get a few things right, and Lee might just tear those down. For example, Yoon took a much tougher stance on North Korea, cutting off all diplomatic channels after years of failed negotiations and opting instead for a strategy of pressure. He also kept a distant relationship with China, treating them as little more than a trading partner. But most importantly, Yoon worked hard to strengthen ties with Japan. And if you know a bit of history, you'll know that Japan has always been a sore subject in South Korea. Ask many South Koreans how they feel about Japan, and you'll likely hear something negative, often due to historical grievances. Grievances many Koreans haven't forgotten. Not to mention the territorial disputes like Japan's ongoing claim over the South Korean Dokdo Islets. All of that has kept relationships between the two countries complicated at best. Now, Lee's Democratic Party has traditionally capitalized on that resentment, often throwing more fuel on the fire. So it's very likely that Lee will return to a more distant tone with Japan, despite the diplomatic progress of the last couple of years. And that's not good news. Like it or not, South Korea and Japan share a lot of common interests. They are the only two liberal democracies in the region, along with Taiwan. They face the same strategic threats from China and North Korea, and both are under growing military pressure from Beijing and direct threats from Pyongyang. If they each go their own way and weaken their cooperation, that only serves to empower their adversaries. And that, well, doesn't seem like the smartest move, especially considering most of those tensions are rooted in events that happened a century ago. And yet that's exactly the kind of stance Lee has supported for years, even if now he's suddenly starting to say things like this.
Cooperation with the United States and Japan is essential, but we should not put all our eggs in one basket.
What you just heard basically boils down to one thing: a shift towards more bilateralism in foreign policy. In other words, treating China and the United States in a more balanced, equidistant way, without leaning so heavily towards Washington's strategic positions. And to be fair, Trump's played a big role in accelerating South Korea's pivot towards China. At the end of the day, Lee doesn't want South Korea getting dragged into conflicts that aren't its own, whether it's a trade war or even a potential military confrontation over Taiwan between the US and China. In fact, during the campaign, the new president even said this:
Why should it matter so much to us if China and Taiwan engage in conflict? We can say jie jie to China and jie jie to Taiwan and get along with both.
If China were to invade Taiwan, all signs point to Lee looking the other way, just like he's done with Ukraine, by the way. His party even threatened to block any attempt to send offensive military aid to Ukraine. And so far, throughout the entire war, South Korea hasn't sent any lethal weapons directly to Kiev. And when Yoon's government considered opening that door, especially after North Korea sided with Russia in the Battle of Kursk, Lee Jae-myung's party was quick to slam it shut.
The Yoon administration is reportedly considering providing offensive weapons to Ukraine in the wake of Russia's deployment of North Korean troops. This is an incredibly dangerous idea that treats people's lives like pawns in a game of chess.
In short, Lee's foreign policy is expected to be more pragmatic, less ideological, and less aligned with Western positions. Basically, playing both sides between China and the United States. Even if a conflict were to break out right on South Korea's doorstep, like in Taiwan. And that's not good news, because it means stepping away from the role South Korea should be playing as one of the few consolidated democracies in Asia in defending a rules-based international order. But here's the thing: his biggest foreign policy challenge isn't China, North Korea, or even Japan. It's Donald Trump.
Global trade chaos threatens South Korea's survival, says Lee Jae-myung in an inauguration speech.
And on this, Lee is absolutely right. Trump's tariffs pose a much bigger threat to South Korea than to many other countries. Exports make up around 40% of South Korea's GDP, which makes the country highly vulnerable to disruptions in global trade flows. And the thing is, Trump's tariffs are targeting exactly the sectors that matter most: steel, semiconductors, cars, and tech products. And those are the very exports that keep South Korea's economy alive. But it doesn't stop there. South Korea also relies heavily on a triangular trade model where China plays a central role. South exports electronic components and semiconductors to China. China assembles them into finished products, which are then exported to the US and Europe. So when Trump slapped 145% tariffs on Chinese products, the demand for South Korean components and goods dropped sharply. And that blow dealt a major hit to the economy, one that explains much of the slowdown South Korea is experiencing right now. Bottom line, this is going to be the mother of all battles that President Lee will have to face in the coming months.
I will crawl between his legs if necessary, and if that's what I have to do for my people. But I am not a pushover either. South Korea also has quite a few cards to play in give-and-take negotiations with the US.
Everything we just told you is without a doubt going to trigger a wave of change in South Korea. The number one challenge for Lee will be to heal the wounds of a deeply polarized society, something he might not be able to pull off because he himself is such a polarizing figure. And let's be honest, talking about judicial coups and proposing to fire judges doesn't exactly help bring people together. Still, one thing is clear. Change is coming in relations with China, North Korea, and the United States, whether it's for better or worse, well, only time will tell. What's for sure is that this new presidency in South Korea is going to give us a lot to talk about. And as always, we'll keep you updated right here on VisualPolitik. But now, it's your turn. Do you think Lee Jae-myung is the president South Korea needed right now? Or could his political views and legal troubles just prolong the country's political crisis? If you were in his shoes, what would you do? Would you try to reduce dependence on Trump's America? Yes or no? Let us know in the comments. We'll be reading. And hey, if you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. It's free and it helps us out a lot. As always, thank you so much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.